Welcome to another edition of Lo Dijeron. They said it. My name is Fernando Rivera. I'm a professor of sociology and director of the Puerto Rico Research Hub here at the University of Central Florida. So today we got two special guests, and we're going to talk about that consequential issue that is so important to the future of Puerto Rico, and we'll get into that. But before we do that, let me introduce our guest today. We have Martin Rivera, that serves as Director of Advocacy for the Puerto Rico Statehood Council. Previously, Martin served as Senior Policy Counselor for the National Hispanic Media Coalition, where he saw policy initiatives to close the digital divide and provide broadband resources to underserved communities. And we'll put, if you want to know more about him, you can find him on the World Wide Web. And we also have Alberto Medina. He's an author, activist, and advocate for Puerto Rican independence. He is the president of Boricuas Unidos en la Diáspora, a national advocacy organization of Puerto Ricans in the United States, working towards Puerto Rico decolonization and sovereignty. So, gentlemen, welcome to Lo Dijeron.
Thank you, Fernando.
Thank you so much. Great to be
So,
here.
before we get into the topic, right, let us know a little bit about yourself, how you got involved in this thing. So, Alberto, let's start with you.
Sure, yeah. I always say I'm an accidental activist. This isn't my background. I don't come from the world of politics. My degree was in literature. And I'm born and raised in Puerto Rico, and I've lived back and forth as so many of us have. Currently, I'm based in Colorado. And I got into this work really as a writer, and it's a lot of the work that I still do. But I saw, even since I was in college here in the States, that there was such a lack and such a need of writing, of commentary, information, analysis about Puerto Rico in general, of course, which, as we know, is so undercovered by the U.S. media and U.S. institutions, but about the issue of Puerto Rico status specifically, in English and in mainstream, U.S. publications. So I wanted to help fill that gap and meet that need, and that's how I started to get involved in a lot of these conversations and efforts, and that led me to Boricuas Unidos en la Diáspora, or BUDPR, which, as you said, is a national organization that educates, organizes, and advocates for Puerto Rico's sovereignty. Got involved with them about 5 years ago and became the president a few years ago. So I say all that, and I start with the part about accidental activists because I think it's what we need more of. We need more people from all walks of life, from all backgrounds, people who aren't lawyers, aren't necessarily political activists, at least in terms of their professional background, right? To get involved in this work and in this issue and take up this cause. So happy to hopefully lead by example a little bit.
Good to go. Well, a little bit about the Puerto Rico Statehood Council first. The Puerto Rico Statehood Council is a 501c4 nonpartisan issue advocacy organization fighting to give full equality to the 3.2 million U.S. citizens of Puerto Rico through statehood.
So, Martin, before we go, so I know most people know what a 501c3 is. What is the difference between that C3 and a C4?
A C4 can do more things on the campaign side.
Okay.
C3s can really cross that line.
Yeah, nonpartisan,
right. But
nonprofit.
But our organization is nonpartisan, meaning we have Democrats, Republicans, all fighting for this issue to finally resolve it after over 127 years of being a territory of the United States. A little bit about myself personally. Originally from Juncos, Puerto Rico. I was also raised here in Central Florida. I'm a fellow UCF alumni.
There you go, people. The Knights listening out there, you could be here one day.
What really got me interested in this issue is when I was working for my hometown member, Congressman Darren Soto, and I saw firsthand, because we were active when he was a state senator, and I worked for him in the state senate. And we obviously the issue of Puerto Rico, having Puerto Rico Day at the Capitol, having our pride first and foremost forward in front of the Capitol gave us a sense of pride. But where I got really into the issue of status, in particular statehood, was when I worked for Congressman Soto in Congress. I saw firsthand the different treatment that Puerto Rico receives, the different attention to our needs. I saw it firsthand when it was. And I experienced it both in two different levels because I experienced it personally also, but also in dealing with the issue was like right after Hurricane Maria. Right after Hurricane Maria, I saw our people having to leave the island because they were derelicted as to their needs, emergency needs, and I had to deal with constituents, resident of Puerto Rico coming here, especially down US 182, and trying to find them short-term housing, getting them access to Medicaid, Medicare here, and
And just to remind the audience, right? So Hurricane Maria was September 20th, 2017. It's almost going to be 10 years already after that. But we know that, sort of we had some issues with the response
Mhm.
and recovery, and sort of a lot of people were drawn here to Florida, specifically Central Florida, for that immediate response and eventually the recovery after that storm.
I saw it firsthand because at that time we had Hurricane Irma also hit Florida, but also Hurricane Harvey hit Texas, and I
Texas,
saw
yeah.
that within weeks they were back to normal. Especially my family lives in Kissimmee still, and everything was back to normal. Puerto Rico, as you mentioned, is still recovering from the hurricane, close to 10 years since it occurred. And that differential treatment got me more activated to resolve these issues, especially the inequality that comes straight as a result of the current territory status of the island.
Well, thank you so much. So, one of the things in sort of my research, I stop assuming that people know about Puerto
Mhm.
Rico or know about the issues going on. And probably a lot of the listeners that are drawn because they're Puerto Rican and might be interested in this. But for your average listener that doesn't know anything about what's going on, what is the issue? What is the significance of talking about the Puerto Rico political status?
Um, I'll go first. Well, at least for us, is like you mentioned, this issue. Not a lot of people know about it. Like, unless you're Puerto Rican yourself, and which is an issue that there's a lot of passions. Most people aren't aware that Puerto Rico has been in U.S. territory for over 127 years. That we are U.S. citizens. That we've been U.S. citizens for 109 years. We just celebrated that anniversary on the 2nd of this month, and we've been in every conflict of the U.S., including the conflicts today. But again, we don't have that equal representation in Congress. We have a non-voting member in the House, no voice at all in the Senate, and we have no vote for our commander in chief. So, in relation to Maria, we had no representation, and we saw that dereliction of the duty of the federal government to actually give aid to the people of Puerto Rico, mainly because it didn't have that voice in the chambers that matter most. And right now, given all the conflicts that are going on in Iran, and also recently in the issues in Venezuela, we're the tip of the spear. Not only do we have our people in the forefront, but our island is being used as a staging ground. But again, whether you agree with the actions of the Trump administration or not, into these military conflicts, we have no say whatsoever. And that to me is unjust, and it's something that we have to keep informing people, because even in Congress, every 2 years we hit the reset button, and you have new members and new staffers. And like you mentioned, you're surprised sometimes that people don't know about this, but I've been used to starting from 101 because the importance of actually resolving this issue once and for all, whether it be statehood, independence, or independence with free association, we need to give Puerto Rico that sovereignty that is required. And you can only achieve that either becoming a dual sovereign as a state or an independent nation with or without that compact of free association. Obviously, there are new realities. I've mentioned the 2 years. We have a new resident commissioner who believes in Puerto Rico staying as a current territory status. So negotiations are ongoing.
Yeah, no, and Alberto, kind of like in your response, right? I think a lot of people misunderstand kind of like the Puerto Rican politics in Puerto Rico, right? So
Mhm.
most of the parties are based on their positions within the political status, right? Although there's been some new political movements that trying to kind of like shy away from the political status things. It's different from here that we have mostly Democrats and Republicans, and that's sort of kind of like the parties out here. In Puerto Rico, we have more parties established based on the political status in terms of that. So if you can mention a little bit, kind of like the background and why it's so important, because it's not only that we have sort of these political parties have their agendas, but the principal type of agendas are tied to their visions of the political status. So Alberto.
Yeah, and I think it speaks to how fundamental this issue is. Usually politics are about what kind of country do we want to be, right? The Democrats here in the United States have a vision for what they'd like the country to look like. The Republicans have a different vision. In Puerto Rico, the still unanswered question is, do we even want to be a country, right? What do we want our political future to be? Um, the interesting thing about this issue and this debate is that a lot of times we're looking at the same facts, right? Which we shouldn't take for granted right now, because I think a lot of people in U.S. politics right now aren't necessarily looking at the same facts. I think, often Martina and I are probably looking at the same facts and just sort of having a very different perspective on them. From my perspective and the perspective of independent supporters, Puerto Rico isn't just a territory of American citizens that are missing a few political rights. It is a nation that has been colonized by the United States for 128 years. A nation, made up of a people with a distinct identity, culture, again, nationality, and being a nation, gives us certain rights. A right to self-determination and independence, whether it's something that Puerto Ricans choose or not. And so I think that's a really key distinction, because I think it's different if you think of it as just like, well, here's some American citizens who we haven't quite, we've failed a little bit, and we haven't quite allowed them to achieve the same level of political rights as other American citizens, or whether you think of it as a people that have been subjugated and held, in a system of political subordination for almost 128 years, as Martin said. So when you talk about something like Puerto Ricans participating in the U.S. military, again, two very two very different ways to see that, two very different perspectives. Some might say, yes, I want Puerto Ricans to be able to vote for the commander in chief that can send them to war. I might say, I do say, I'd rather Puerto Rico just not get dragged into any wars, from this precedent or any other. So to me, this is really at the core of the issue and of the argument. Do we recognize? Do we center? Do we prioritize Puerto Ricans' nationhood? A nationhood that is on display. For example, it's just we were chatting right before we started right now at the World Baseball Classic, right, and in so many other moments that allow us to express ourselves as a people. Or is this just a matter of we need to have the U.S. citizens in Puerto Rico kind of catch up to other U.S. citizens. So it's back to the top of your question. I think the reason why it's still unresolved, after 127 years, why the political parties in Puerto Rico primarily focus on it, is because that's a really complicated question. That's a really divisive question, but hopefully having conversations like this helps make it a little bit less divisive.
No, and absolutely right. And sometimes people don't understand that, the same favor that or passion that people display, in the political spectrum, right? If you're Democrat or Republican, and I'm not going to talk to you because you're a Democrat, and I'm not going to talk to you because you're a Republican, sort of find itself in Puerto Rico as well, right? If you're for the Commonwealth Party, So, you have people like my dad, that he grew up, when Puerto Rico, that transition between agricultural and sort of the Industrial Revolution in Puerto Rico under the 1952 Commonwealth status, and Luis Muñoz Marin. And, he was one of that said, like, before I die, I'm going to say that I'm from the Statehood Party. So you lose one PNP than rather somebody from the Commonwealth out here, right? So those passions out here, because they're dictating and all those sort of things, and it leads to all those type of things. So a lot of identity type of politics from the political type of thing. And I think, sometimes people don't understand on this side of the equation, sometimes, that those are kind of like the passions to start the discussion out here. Mm-hmm. And I think we're trying to kind of like break some of the mold in having those conversations here, because you're right. You might see one fact out here in with a set of lenses and a different set of lenses out here. But let's cut to the chase. So, Martin, why should Puerto Rico become a state?
If I may just touch
Sure,
base on one
yeah.
thing, like you mentioned about the political parties, before I go, why Puerto Rico should be a state, you do get your odd bedfellows. I like to call it that way, because people in Puerto Rico, the political parties are based on the status question that you mentioned, but they associate as Democrat or Republican at the federal level. And the best example I have of this is the last governor of Puerto Rico was Pedro Pierluisi, Democrat, but associated with the Statehood Party. He actually got primaried in the Statehood primary for that political party by the current Republican governor, who is of the Statehood Party. Currently, right now, the Democratic Party chair in Puerto Rico is Luis Davila Pernas, who's a Democrat, but at the national level, but is of the Statehood Party. And right now, our current resident commissioner associates with Democrats, but he's of the Partido Popular Democrático, or the Popular Democratic Party,
And
of this that wants to remain as a territory.
and oddly enough, received more votes than the governor.
Yes, received more votes than the governor. But I always use this little fact, especially for statehood, that statehood actually garnered in the last plebiscite more votes than any individual candidate running for political office, more than the resident commissioner and more than the governor herself. So that shows that there is some, in the local parties in Puerto Rico, local party support, cross-party support in favor of statehood.
So it's a little more complicated than we
Yes.
think, right?
That is based on your
not
Chevalles was a double jeopardy case. It was a gun running case. So this defendant got convicted at the federal level, and Puerto Rico wanted to charge him also at the state level. The person claimed double jeopardy, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court said, Puerto Rico, even though you have your constitution established in 1952, even though you're considered yourself the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico, you're still an unincorporated territory, and your sovereignty lies entirely in the U.S. Congress, specifically in the territorial clause of the U.S. Constitution. That exemplified that again. At the end of the day, Puerto Rico, even though we have that pride, and it doesn't change the fact that we remain an unincorporated territory, because there was actually a case, I believe a year or two after, it was U.S. v. Gamble, where similar facts happened in Alabama. The defendant got charged and convicted at the federal level. Alabama wanted to indict him at the state level, and he actually cited Sanchez Valles to say, oh, you can't do that. This is double jeopardy. But the Supreme Court says, like, no, a state is a dual sovereign with the federal government, so double jeopardy doesn't apply. So that kind of
it puts kind of like this unresolved type of things in terms of and I guess in a sense that's some of the things to kind of like your push for statehood to resolve, right?
right. And
But
sorry.
yeah, but so why should Puerto Rico become a state?
At the end of the day, we believe that Puerto Rico has the right to the consent of the government. That's what we believe in this country, that the consent of the government must prevail, because again, putting my lawyer hat on, the federal government can make Puerto Rico an independent nation or a state without a vote on the island. However, we traditionally want to have the consent of the governed. That's what we did with Alaska and Hawaii and 32 other states, because some of them were split from existing states. The reason why I believe in statehood is because the people of Puerto Rico have voted 4 times this century over and over to reject the current territory status and in favor of statehood. They want full equality, which can only be granted in this country if you become a state. Now, if Puerto Rico wants to become an independent nation and achieve sovereignty that way, because that is a legitimate option for Puerto Rico to become an independent nation and have a compact of free association, whether they choose it or not. We have 3 independent nations that have a compact with the United States. That's the Marshall Islands, Micronesia, and Palau. At the end of the day, we have the contributions of Puerto Ricans have not just been in the battlefield. We've contributed in our music. Our culture has actually changed U.S. culture. A lot of people don't forget que salsa started in New York. A lot of our culinary things, my wife is from Chicago, and I find it always funny that jibarito was actually the sandwich jibarito, that you put 2 plantain chips instead of bread. That originates, and that's just culinary, but that originates in Chicago.
No, but some important examples, right, in the things out here. So the same question for Alberto. Why should Puerto Rico become an independent nation?
Yeah, I think it's interesting, Martin, that you started with this phrase of, whatever conversations we might have, it doesn't change the fact that, Puerto Rico's been a territory of the U.S. since 1898. And yeah, again, that's the fact. But I think, frankly, that papers over, what happened in 1898. Puerto Rico didn't become a territory by some, kind of magical, like, ta-da, we're U.S. territory now. This was an invasion as part of a war of expansion and conquest by the U.S., the Spanish-American War. So, let's not paper over invasion and imperialism and realize that, again, what we're talking about is a nation that was conquered and subjugated, ruled directly by the U.S. government for over half a century, and, back to being ruled directly now under Promesa and the Fiscal Oversight Board, which I'm sure we may talk about. But the reason I start with that is because I think that is, again, at the core of the argument, that we are not just talking about some American citizens in a piece of land. The word territory really just means a piece of land. It doesn't describe a political relationship. What describes a political relationship is colonialism. And as Martin said, there are two legitimate ways. I think we both agree for that colonial relationship, which must end, should end, to be changed through statehood or through sovereignty, whether full independence or sovereignty and free association. So why do I prefer independence to statehood? First, because I think independence and having a sovereign country of your own is the natural political manifestation of that nationhood. And it's not just about this feeling of pride and we love being Puerto Rican and we want to be Puerto Rican. It is what allows a people to rule themselves according to their needs, to their desires, to their, idiosyncrasies. Puerto Rico could become a state, and certainly it would have some political power. I would argue, that having a couple senators and 4 members of the U.S. House are worth a lot less now than they used to be, and this idea that Puerto Rico also would have sovereignty through statehood. I'm not so sure. I know that legally, that's kind of the doctrine, this dual sovereignty thing. But when I look around the United States right now and I see the federal government, sending federal agents and the National Guard into states with a lot more Congress people than Puerto Rico would have, and those members of Congress can't do anything about it because the federal government has such awesome power, which it is exercising, by the way, in Puerto Rico as well, in areas like immigration or building up the U.S. military to have an aggressive presence in Latin America. I don't think these are things that Puerto Rico could control or change as a state. I think only independence would give Puerto Ricans the ability to, again, rule ourselves, to develop our society as we see fit. I do also think that the other big part of that nationhood is our culture, and that statehood would necessarily mean assimilation. It's not that the United States isn't a wonderful, multicultural country sometimes, in some places more than others. But think about language, which is really the easiest example. There are, I think, at least a dozen, maybe, U.S. states, especially, the western part of the U.S., that used to be Mexican territory or Spanish territory, that used to be Spanish-speaking places with Spanish-speaking peoples. Of course, there are still, wonderful Spanish-speaking communities there, but in no state is the Spanish still the language of government, the language of education, the language of public life, the way that it is in Puerto Rico. And I think if Puerto Rico became a state, it would have a choice to make between fighting tooth and nail to maintain, the Spanish language and keep operating as a Spanish language society, but then always have that separation from the United States, right? This sort of separate but equal situation, right? Where our fellow Americans that we share a government with and that, make decisions for us still, couldn't even understand what we're talking about, in our public conversations in Puerto Rico, or to assimilate in order to achieve, full equality, at least in that respect. So, again, I think the language issue, which is so fundamental because it is at the heart of culture, is one example of how that could play out. The third argument, which I think is counterintuitive for some people, because they assume that, if nothing else, statehood would at least help Puerto Rico economically, right? I'm actually not so sure, and I think the economists who have looked at this, which frankly is not too many of them, aren't so sure either. Like, yes, there would be some increase in federal funding for Puerto Rico under statehood. It is not, I think, as much as some people might believe, because really Puerto Rico already gets most of the federal funding that it would get as a state. Like, yes, there would be some increase in Medicaid, some increase in food stamps and some other things, but it's not like it would double, triple, quadruple the amount of federal aid that Puerto Rico gets. And then you have the other side of it, which is full federal taxation in Puerto Rico, which, even U.S. institutions like the GAO have said could be disastrous for the Puerto Rican middle class, but also especially for corporations that are currently in Puerto Rico, precisely because it is considered a foreign tax jurisdiction. And, one economist, Jose Caraballo Cueto, has said if even just 10% of U.S. corporations left Puerto Rico after statehood because of, the now full federal taxation, that could be enough to collapse Puerto Rico's economy. Independence, on the other hand, gives Puerto Rico the tools of a sovereign nation to craft an economy that works, again, for us, for our needs, for our people. The ability to have a tax rate that could be both attractive to foreign investment, but also fair and to Puerto Ricans. The ability to set tariffs that help protect Puerto Rican industries, to set duties and port fees, to take advantage of really Puerto Rico's biggest asset, which is the fact that it's 100 miles by 35, right, the landmass, but Puerto Rico would control an exclusive economic zone of its maritime area of more than 70,000 square miles. And, the ability to sign trade deals with other countries, and of course to be free of the Jones Act, which is a huge, huge economic burden to Puerto Rico with over $1 billion a year directly, but much more indirectly when you think about energy is more expensive, so it's harder to start a business. Food is more expensive, so it's harder to start a restaurant. And then lastly, and I hope we'll get into this because I know it's a lot of what Martin's work is, and it's just the political feasibility of it. Puerto Rico has been a territory, a colony, for 128 years. All of the plebiscites that Martin mentioned that Puerto Rico has had, they have all been ignored by Congress, both before the fact, because Congress has never wanted to make them, binding, and after the fact, because all of these results, including the pro-statehood results, which I acknowledge, have been ignored, are being ignored right now. Statehood got its best result in 2024, and nothing has happened. And so I think after 127, almost 128 years, we have enough evidence that it hasn't happened, it won't happen, it won't have the votes in the Senate, where it requires 60 votes, right? I'm not even sure it would get 50 under, a scenario where there's no filibuster, and even members of Congress like Nidia Velázquez, who has done a lot of work on this issue, have said that. And so I'm tired of waiting, and I'm tired of the colonial status, keeping Puerto Rico, again, under a system of political subordination that leads to poverty, that leads to precarity for our people. I think 128 years is enough evidence that Congress has no intention to make Puerto Rico a state. The reason why even a process can't advance is because the possibility of statehood acts as a poison pill in any decolonization process. But I do think that you actually could get a political coalition together to support independence, between liberals, Democrats who do want to see Puerto Rico decolonized, and conservatives and Republicans who, frankly, some of them would love to get rid of Puerto Rico because they don't want to keep sending billions of dollars to an island of poor brown people in the Caribbean.
Well, you bring a lot of layers to
I know that was a lot.
the
I know
discussion,
that was a
right,
lot,
in terms
but-
of that. But before I ask the next question, right, and Martin, you can
please
and I think, and even even with that, kind of
try
like
to
in the
be
question, you can. But you mentioned Promesa, right? And for the listeners that don't know that, the government of Puerto Rico declared bankruptcy, and in 2016, the U.S. Congress passed the Puerto Rico Oversight Management and Economic Stability Act. The acronym is for Promesa, and the purpose, just really briefly, the purpose of the oversight board is to provide a method for a covered territory to achieve fiscal responsibility and access to the capital markets.
Mhm.
So, Martin, I'm going to let you
Yeah,
kind of like react to some of the things,
but a
but
little bit on Promesa.
yeah,
A lot of people don't know is that the reason why you even have to have Promesa in the first place is because Puerto Rico and DC were taken out of Chapter 9 bankruptcy in 1984. So even when, again, put my lawyer hat on, before Promesa, when we were dealing with the debt crisis, Puerto Rico tried to pass its own kind of debt restructuring law. And even though it was kicked out in 1984, the Supreme Court said, sorry, you're preempted from establishing your own bankruptcy proceedings, even though you're excluded from it.
yeah, no. So it's been, and then there's been some issues where you're not,
Yes.
you're not, and I think in all the discussions we do agree in a sense, right, that there's kind of like an uncertainty of how the processes do actually work because of the
Some rights
uncertainty of
apply, some
and all those
don't.
sort of things. And
Alberto mentioned in regards to taxation, like we're like right now with President Trump's tariffs, we're not subject to tariffs because obviously we're in the U.S. customs zone, but like in other parts in taxation, we're treated differently.
yeah,
So-
there's a lot of things. So kind of the question is, so we talk about sort of your push for kind of like the political status, but what are some of the biggest misconceptions about being a state? And you can react to some of the things that
Sure,
Alberto
and-
said, but let's go back to kind of like the big misconceptions that people have, right?
And this is I would say this is one of the misconceptions, especially, and you mentioned it, Alberto. Because, well, one thing is like Puerto Rico was annexed when it was in 1898, when we became a territory, when the U.S. took possession of Puerto Rico and has the sovereignty over the territory. So annexation ya pasó. What we're trying to give people is equality and that sovereignty. Again, you can achieve sovereignty as a state or as an independent nation. And that sovereignty as a state. So like a good example would be a sovereignty, like right now dealing with the immigration issues. The big pushback, the big fight against what the Trump administration has been doing has been coming from the states, from Governor Newsom in California, Governor Pritzker in Illinois, in regards to the overreaches in Minnesota, and unfortunately, the legal system does take its sweet time sometimes, but that shows you the states' rights power to push back on the federal government because it is a dual sovereign. One misconception is that if Puerto Rico becomes a state, we're going to lose our language, that we're going to lose our culture. Language is a states' rights issue. It's under the 10th Amendment. And currently, Puerto Rico, the official languages of Puerto Rico are English and Spanish. Alberto mentioned how some past states have lost some of their culture and maybe their language. And that is true. When you become a state, it's up to that state and the state legislature and the people living in that state to preserve that language. I know we always use the example of Hawaii, but I always like using the example of New Mexico. Right now, the ranking member in the Committee of Jurisdiction, Teresa Leger Fernandez, her parents were actually the ones who implemented preservation of Spanish, and not only Spanish, but also native languages in New Mexico. So it was up to the state to uphold their language. It's not the federal government. There's no official language of the United States. I know that President Trump recently did an executive order.
There's an executive order out there,
but again, the executive order has really it's not official U.S. law until it can be challenged. And no state that's actually become a state of the union has had a language requirement imposed on them. Florida, when it became a state, was primarily Spanish-speaking. Louisiana, that's another state. When it became a state, English was the third language. It was Spanish, French, and then English was the main language. So majority Spanish language in a territory is not a reason to prevent the full incorporation of that territory. It hasn't been in the past, and it shouldn't be now. Another issue that Alberto mentioned was in regards to what is the power that, like, if Puerto Rico becomes a state, what strength would that be given in comparison to an independent nation? And Alberto mentioned that he doesn't know the strength, how much a single senator will do. I have worked in the state legislature and in issues dealing with Congress for over 10 years, and I have seen firsthand how one single senator can change the entire outlook of a legislative agenda. I remember when we were trying to do Build Back Better under the Biden administration, and it was Senator Manchin alone who changed that bill. Right now, we're in a 50-50 Senate. One senator alone can change the entire political outlook of any piece of legislation, and not just in the Senate, but right now in the House, I believe we are at a 1-vote margin. So yes, a delegation of 4 members of Congress can have significant changes in any future legislation. And Alberto also mentioned the Jones Act. One quick fact that is like something that stateholders don't usually like to hear is that, yeah, if Puerto Rico becomes a state, the Jones Act's still in place. Hawaii is subjected to the Jones Act, so it's Alaska. One thing that I would say is that you have, power comes in numbers. If you have 3 delegations, congressional delegations pushing to amend the Jones Act, to change it, that gives it more strength to actually hopefully do some changes that are needed, because Hawaii faces the same issues as we do of higher prices for goods. So does
imports.
And I don't know. Maybe I'm just a legislative political wonk, but I count the numbers.
No, and that's fine. And so the same question to you, Alberto. What is the biggest misconceptions out there about an independent Puerto Rico?
I think there's a lot, yeah, and I'll get to a couple of them. I do want to respond just to one thing, and I don't want to completely make this a back and forth. But this idea of like, look, annexation already happened. Again, I think this is just papering over, conquest, basically saying like, well, look, they already stole it, so like it belongs to them already. Like, why should we? It's like it's too late to do anything about it kind of attitude. And I always ask people, if the United States invaded a nation tomorrow, would you say like, well, look, they already took it, so let's just work on, making the best we can of it, If
So-
the US
so-
if the US took
yeah.
over Greenland tomorrow, so because again, in this current era, the idea of the United States invading a place to keep it is no longer sort of a theoretical scenario necessarily. Should the US keep just whatever place it takes and we just have to accept it because annexation already happened? Or is that something that we should resist and call for that place to be freed? So, I just want to say that because, again, I think it's very easy to sort of rhetorically say, like, well, look, it's been so long. Puerto Rico's already part of the U.S., like, which it's not legally. At this point, like, what the hell, right? Let's just try to
So,
keep...
so Alberto, and I think it comes into, and I'll let you kind of
Yeah.
respond, but so in a sense, right, what would be sort of the relationship of a free Puerto Rico with the United States?
Well, and this gets to the question of the misconceptions, because
Mhm.
I think one of the biggest ones is that, those of us who believe in independence, that we hate the United States, that we're anti-American, that we want Puerto Rico to, be an enemy of the U.S. And look, there's probably a handful of people who do believe that just because of their other, political leanings. And we certainly hate colonialism. And to the extent that the United States has kept Puerto Rico colonized for, over a century, we think that is something to hate and to oppose and to criticize in very, very strong terms. But, this isn't a matter of like, we hate the U.S., we want nothing to do with them. Most supporters of independence want Puerto Rico and the United States to have a relationship of friendship and cooperation, economically and otherwise. We recognize that the U.S. is obviously the hegemonic power in the hemisphere and in the world, and that it would be to Puerto Rico's benefit to maintain a good relationship, but a relationship between equals, right? So I think that is what most of us want. That is what, for example, the leadership of the Puerto Rican Independence Party wants. And there is that misconception about it that I think is worth clearing up. I think one of the other ones is that independence remains this sort of hyper minority proposition that only has a handful of supporters. That may have been true a few decades ago. You could argue that it was never really true because these plebiscites, for various reasons we could get into, I don't think have always been best at measuring public sentiment. But I'm not going to sit here and deny that statehood, has had more public support than independence. I just think those people are wrong. And that's what we do in politics.
And
right?
we can talk
Yeah.
about it and disagree and all sort of things. So,
Well, and by the way, but just
Yeah.
one last point on that, for the first two Puerto Rican plebiscites, the Commonwealth had the support of the people. Presumably, you think that those people were wrong when they voted for the Commonwealth. We were just talking about the new, poll from the Puerto Rico Research Hub that showed a plurality of Puerto Ricans in Florida supporting the colonial Commonwealth. Presumably, we both think that those people are wrong, even if they are not the majority, but the plurality. So, I think this is another misconception, actually, that, and I'll promise I'll end with this, that, it's just got to be like whatever the people want. And it's like, take that argument to Congress then, and I know you do, and I commend you for it. And as I said, I think it's shameful that Congress has, ignored this issue and ignored, the will of the Puerto Rican people, such as it is. But it's okay to say, like, yeah, I think a lot of people, want that. I think those people are wrong. If you are a Democrat in this country, you probably think that the majority of your fellow Americans were wrong in 2024 because President Trump, won with a majority of the vote. So I think
the other side as well, right?
Of course, yeah. And if you're a conservative, then you think, your fellow Americans were wrong in 2020. So I think we have to discuss this issue from a perspective of our facts and our values and of what we want, and what we believe is good and just and possible for Puerto Rico, and not merely let's scan the latest polls and see what's in the lead. And, that's what our ideology is going to be. I think we owe more to this issue and to the Puerto Rican people than just like seeing what's in the lead right now and deciding to sort of thoughtlessly support that.
No, and absolutely. And kind of like to your point, so for the listeners as well, if you go to our webpage, we have been doing surveys of Puerto Ricans in Florida, and we've seen some changes out here in terms of the preference. But we know this doesn't happen in a vacuum. There's a lot of context. There's a lot of evolution, and it's not set in stone, right? As we know, it's been 128 years. If 100% of people were on the same page, it might have been a different discussion out here. We can argue about that as well. But we need, I think, at the end of the day, is that it's not set in stone. There's ebbs and flows in all those type of things. So to end, right, in all sort of things, and I promise you, Martin, to serve that. So last comment, and then where can people find your work, the organization, and all sort of things, so they get more informed and kind of like see the different viewpoints?
Oh, of course. Well, first, you can find more about the Puerto Rico Statehood Council at pr51st.com. There you can find fact sheets, a little bit about our organization, and some of the efforts that we're trying to do to finally resolve this issue. But just to go back to a few points, you mentioned Alberto annexation, and the reason, again, put my lower hat back on, is because it is a legal definition. At the end of the day, annexation means taking control. Doesn't mean full incorporation or integration in the international sense. Right now, for example, in Ukraine, Crimea has been annexed. Doesn't mean it's been incorporated into Russia. Right now, like when you said that, does annexation mean that that it's done and that Puerto Rico has to be fully incorporated? I don't agree with that, because at the end of the day, that's where Puerto Rico is right now. Puerto Rico has been annexed. It is, like you mentioned, not a part of the U.S., a possession of the United States. I've seen it in several appropriations bills where it's listed possessions of the United States. Puerto Rico is right there. And even there was a case coming out of American Samoa in regards to somebody requesting U.S. citizenship because he wanted to travel here. It was the Fitzsimonu case. And that case stopped didn't go all the way to the Supreme Court. But that case also exemplified that at the end of the day, being born in a territory is not being born in the United States under the 14th Amendment. Again, our citizenship in Puerto Rico was given through statute to the Jones-Shaffer Act. Separate from the Jones Act, that different bill. Mm-hmm. But that Jones-Shaffer Act, we have statutory citizenship. And because of that reality, it's being born in a territory it's not a part of the United States. So the 14th Amendment does not apply to us on that. Well, what the Puerto Rico Statehood Council has been trying to seek is to finally resolve this issue, because the path for Puerto Rico is still open. It can become an independent nation with or without that compact, or it can become a state of the United States. Alternatively, also can stay as a territory, which I hope that me and Alberto agree that we shouldn't stay a territory. And Alberto also mentioned one thing that I have seen firsthand that maybe some stateholders don't want to highlight, is that independence has been gaining steam in Puerto Rico. There's a multitude of issues that can give Puerto Rico, take a lot of our residents out of raise them above the poverty line. But
so I don't want to cut you short, but we're running short of time. So Alberto, I want to give you the last word, where they can find information about your group, and any last word that you want to say.
Yeah, absolutely. So to learn more about Boricuas Unidos en la Diáspora, or BUDPR as we call it, and that's the URL, budpr.org. Folks can also find us on social media, Bud Puerto Rico on Instagram and TikTok. And going back to what I said at the beginning, this work is for all of us. I think one thing that, Martin and I also hopefully agree on is that we need more people power on this issue, on whatever side of it, you happen to find yourself. I obviously hope that I can persuade a few more people over to the pro-independence camp. But this is an issue that doesn't often move in Congress or in the media or in American life. That's why I'm so grateful and excited to have the opportunity to have these conversations. I think one of the reasons why it can seem, and I acknowledge, a lot that action that happened in Congress. But, respectfully, it's like, ooh, we got some hearings. Like, a bill passed the House in the last day of a lame duck session and was never even going to be seen by the Senate. We're so used to nothing happening on Puerto Rico that when even a little bit happens, even if it's still miles and miles away from what would actually have to happen, for something to actually become law, much less that, these bills aren't even to change Puerto Rico's status, but just to finally create a binding process to change Puerto Rico's status. But there's so little action on this issue politically in Congress for I think reasons we could talk about all day.
Absolutely, and I think
but that's why we need more people involved, because that's how politics works. People need to feel pressure from their constituents, from their voters. Almost nobody in this country asks their representative, like, hey, do you have a position on Puerto Rico? It's not even an expectation that a member of Congress or any political leader would have that. That's what ultimately we need to change for, Martin's sake and for mine, because we do both agree
Oh,
that
yeah.
this
And I
political
think at the
status
end
has
of
to
the
end.
day, with our conversation, right, there's just different levels of involvement, right? And there might be some hopeful steps in the legislative process, but there might be some more in more the activism and more in kind of like the social movement and all those type of things. So this is not kind of like one size fits all type of solution.
It's more of a puzzle piece. You need the activism, and you need to have that information, because we did get and you mentioned it, because I will say, like, the legislative stuff. Just one, we did get unanimous support from Democrats in the 117th Congress, 16 Republicans, and you did mention that last week, and the House was actually going to flip to Republicans. So I think getting 16 Republicans,
and obviously, from a legislative side and all those type of things, this has been fascinating. We're running out of time, but this has been a fascinating discussion. There's more layers to it that people analyze, but we can have a conversation, we can educate, and hopefully our listeners find this very useful. This is Lo Dijeron, they said it. My name is Fernando Rivera. I'm professor of sociology and director of the Puerto Rico Research Hub. So thank you for listening in, and we'll see you next time.